Hey, folks, this is our lecture on Karl Marx and Marxism. You may be quite familiar with Karl Marx. He's one of the more famous theorists that we've covered. He's famous in political science and philosophy and sociology and economics and history. Everybody claims Marx as their own, and we'll do the same here in political science and political theory. Um, Marx is a special theorist for me personally because it was studying Marx and walking around with my Marx Engels reader way back in the day, back in college, that convinced me maybe I wanted to go into political science. I just really enjoyed the depth of his thought. And so even if you are a hardcore liberal, hardcore capitalist, I hope you can take a lot from the depth of Marx's discussion of not simply equality and justice, but also freedom and meaning, and what it means to live a good life. I think that there's a lot of attraction in going back and studying the ancients and this idea of what is a good life, what is a meaningful life. And in many respects, I think that Marx is the best standard bearer who takes up that question. So in this class, we read a little bit of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, which was unpublished, but I think, along with the German ideology, captures the really nice early Marx, who was more philosophical again about this idea of freedom and meaning, um, and what it means to live a truly human life. I think is sort of an essential question. Right, the fight against dehumanization and the ways in which modern society dehumanizes us is very well captured in those early works. We're not reading Capital; it's entirely too long and too dense. But it is Marx's most famous and complete work, part of what we would call the later Marx. And we are looking at the manifesto of the Communist Party, the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848 and republished again and again and again. That work written with Friedrich Engels, who is his lifelong partner, not lifelong partner, his intellectual partner for much of the later part of his life, his activist, more mature thinking phase. That's a famous work, and also it contains some strong expressions of the ideals of communism and the critique of capitalism. But it's also a polemical work and a political work, and an important one in that respect. All right. I'm not sure Marx's biography is as essential in understanding his thought as some of the thinkers that we've dealt with recently, but it's certainly worth looking into. So Marx here, with his classic Karl Marx beard, was born in Prussia, right, Germany, at the time. His father was a lawyer, so he's from a professional, middle class family, Jewish family, but converted to Christianity, likely for professional reasons, which perhaps was important in shaping some of Marx's views on the role of religion. He studied law and philosophy, specifically in Berlin. And there he encountered the ideas of Hegel and Hegel's father. Hegel, died in 1830 or something like that. But the Hegelians, the young Hegelians, the successors to Hegel, were all the rage at the time, and they dominated philosophical thought in the German tradition. And Marx was one of them, and yet also always had sort of an uneasy truce with the other Hegelians. There was a lot of dispute within this area of philosophy about sort of its relationship to truth and history, and the process and evolution of ideas, which were central themes in Hegel. And Marx ends up sort of breaking off in an interesting way. That when you study Marx in real depth, you usually start by reading Hegel. In order to understand sort of the basis for where Marx moves. But just worth noting there that Marx, was an academic in this sense, right? He got a doctorate, a PhD. He wrote a dissertation about not the ancient Greeks that we read, but ancient Greek philosophy. And so, right, he was steeped in these philosophical traditions. He was, started off pursuing a career as an academic, as a teacher, and shifted over relatively early to publishing. He ran a newspaper, an opposition sort of radical newspaper. Evolved into a writer and published some important works, including writing the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Um, a lot of this had to do with sort of his meeting and his partnership with Friedrich Engels, who was a bit more on the activist side. They wrote together, and a lot of Marx's important works are written with Engels. But Engels was always, I think, a little more active in the organizing side of things, right? So. In the latter part of Marx's life, he's living in London. He had lived in Paris for a while, lives in London, working out of the British Museum. If anyone's ever been to London, a really cool place. You can see some of the places Marx worked there, and dies in London. And so, he's living in this advanced liberal industrial society, but he's also looking. If anyone's read George Orwell, not just Animal Farm and such, but read George Orwell. What is it? Down and Out in Paris and London. Some of his works of that period. It's a little later, but right, describing the Industrial Revolution and the industrialization, people in coal mines and factories, and things like that in the industrial Western Europe, Germany, France, England. This is, part of what Marx is looking at: the rise of urban poverty and the concentration of industrial wealth in a handful of hands. These are sort of the social conditions in which Marx is writing and considering the plight and the increasing plight of the poor. And the increasingly difficult, poor, and exploited working conditions of the masses of people, though he lived comfortably himself. And I'll say, when I did a summer doing a couple of classes in London at the end of my college time, I actually walked up to Highgate Cemetery, a couple of miles outside of London, in like 100-degree weather. It was grueling to go find Marx's grave in this cool old cemetery. And so I was clearly at the time very into Marx and Marxism, which I still am, right? I think Marx is very cool. But his meanings to me have evolved over time. Anyway, right? So Marx, an influential writer, and of course we know that his writings on Marxism and communism, which are a strain, a type of theory related to or part of socialism, right? So there are different socialist ideas and proposals that are competing to represent the left. And Marx's communist ideas, or his Marxist ideas, as we often call them now, end up being especially important and especially dominant in certain revolutionary groups, and particularly Vladimir Lenin and the Russian Revolution that would happen, a couple of decades into the 20th century, right? So, well after Marx has died, but his ideas have lived on and have been influential, not just in Russia and China, but also particularly in a lot of Latin American political theory and Latin American social movements, political movements. And so Marx is an especially important character. And I will again argue to you guys that even if you reject the idea of communism as either a practical solution or an ideal solution, Marxism itself holds an important sort of perspective and critique that can help us live a better life in our liberal capitalism. All right, bit of a formatting issue here, but no worry, right? Those words, antithesis, synthesis, you can read them. They're single words with the s's dropped down below. Let's start with Hegel for a second here, and it's worth noting. It's worth going back to Martin Luther King, who wrote this sort of survey of his journey his intellectual journey to nonviolence. And one of the most interesting parts to me is his discussion of Marx and Hegel, where he finds a lot of value in Marx, and yet in the end says, I side with Hegel about the power of ideas as opposed to the power of material circumstances and material realities. In the end, perhaps because of his religious leanings, or perhaps because simply his attraction to the power of ideas, MLK sides with Hegel a little bit on what drives history, what drives progress, what drives change, right? So Hegel, is often associated with maybe, we might call it idealism, or this idea that history is driven by a dialectic, a back and forth of ideas, of ideologies and ideas, right? And the idea that there's a dominant set of ideas or ideologies or system of thinking that tends to shape the world, that tends to shape how people think about the world, about shapes epistemology, how people understand the world, shapes ontology, how people think the world works. Their religious views, their moral views, their ethical views, their political views, and that structures the world as it is. But there are always challengers. It's never static. It's always dynamic. Whatever is the dominant set of thoughts of the day is always going to be challenged by new ideas. And when a particularly strong challenger comes to the fore, the clash between the thesis, right, the thesis being the existing dominant set of ideas, and the antithesis, the alternative set of ideas, that what this does, this clash ends up producing a new dominant thesis that he calls the synthesis of the two, right? It's you might say that it's a melding of the two, or it's a new version of one or the other that is different from how it was originally presented. The idea that the clash of ideas drives the development of each, and that then once you have a new thesis, that it will be challenged then again by new ideas, and that this is the way the clash of ideas dialectically propels us forward throughout history. And I'll give you an example on the next slide. Actually, I'll just let me pop over to the next slide right now. Right, so this is not a Hegelian example, because this happens, this is really after Hegel, and again, I've got the M dropping down there. But the idea that capitalism, liberalism, capitalism, related ideas there, that these are dominant ideas, say in the era of Locke, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and that they're challenged. This idea of free markets and such is challenged by the antithesis of communism or Marxism, or this idea, or socialism, and that the clash of those ideas over several decades ends up producing a new version of capitalism that's not like the earlier version of capitalism, but that incorporates some of the critiques and some of the ideas of communism and socialism that we might call welfare capitalism, or we might call it social democracy, or whatever our modern form of liberal capitalism is, where we consider the role of government in redistributing and providing basic care for the people as much more robust than we did during the previous thesis of sort of what we might call laissez-faire capitalism, the idea of a minimal government that's not responsible for much. You take care of yourself, Lockean or even Hobbesian perhaps state compared to a thicker state that has larger obligations to the welfare and the equality of the people in society. And right, so this idea of two ideas confront each other, and you have a exchange of ideas, a marketplace of ideas, to use sort of a Millian phrase, and those forces produce sort of a compromise or a settling. One wins, one loses, but the conflict itself reshapes the ideas and reshapes the settlement between them. And so, we might say that a theme that maybe appears in this lecture is that you have, capitalism with all its warts and flaws and all the suffering it's causing, but also all the productivity it's producing. You get the critique of leftists who say this is unjust, this is exploitation, this is the oppression of the masses, and you get a synthesis that says, well, right, an FDR kind of New Deal synthesis that says, well, the role of government is going to have to evolve, and while we're going to maintain private ownership in marketplaces, we're going to regulate those through democratic forces that control the excesses of capitalism and redistribute those massively productive forces. Right, but again, for Hegel, it's the ideas, the battle of ideas, that are pushing this forward. So Marx is famously described as having inverted Hegel or Hegelian philosophy. And in the slide as I designed it, this handsome gentleman here was supposed to be upside down. And I'm not sure why that didn't take. But what do we mean by the idea that he inverted Hegel? Well, again, Hegel's idea is that ideas structure society. So politics, economy, the way we live our lives is structured by the ideas that dominate that period, and those ideas clash and fight to persuade the most people and to sort of dominate popular opinion. Conversely, what Marx does, and what is perhaps one of his most profound and lasting theoretical legacies, is he proposes that no, it's in fact the way we live our lives, in particular our material interests, the way we make our livings and the way we distribute our resources, that drive our ideas. That our ideas are in fact a product of the material forces that are already present in our world, right? And he calls this his dialectical materialism. It's still a dialectic. It's still a back and forth, a clash, but it's a clash between material interests, and the ideas are just sort of what I call here the window dressing, right? So history here is driven by material interests, and specifically Marx argues that in every historical epoch there are two great classes. The class that owns the means of production, the ownership class, and then the working class, or the class that's exploited or has value extracted from them. The dominant class controls the institutions and the ideology, the system of thinking that dominates the time, and those institutions, including political institutions, and the ideologies, including religion and morality, as well as views on things like race and gender, all of that serves to sustain the mode of production and its distribution, right? So who gets what, where, when, how. All of our ideas and our institutions, in Marx's mind, come to serve the powerful class, the rich class, the class that's got all the stuff. And whether or not the individuals of that class are, sort of scheming to disseminate these ideas is really not the idea. It's more that they come to believe, and the institutions that come to affirm the rightness or the naturalness or the justness of the current order are the ones that survive and spread, because they make the important people feel good and feel justified, and they comfort or suppress or placate the people who are in a lower position, right? And so this will get us to, in the next slide, we talk about Marx's famous controversial statement that religion is the opiate of the masses. It kind of sedates the masses and makes them feel okay and compliant in their painful existence, and that's what ideology does. It makes people think that, well, my place in life is terrible, but it's the place that, it is what it is, right? It is what it is. It's the only way it could be. and maybe it's just, maybe it's deserved, and all those other people, they're in poor places in their lives for reasons that are just and make sense, and have to do with the way the world works, or the way the world should work. Um, Now, Marx does say, though, right, part of his idea of dialectical materialism is that it moves forward, that it's not static, and that's because each system has its own contradictions, and those contradictions get heightened and sharpened as the particular historical period moves on, and eventually they raise conflict and cause a breaking point. And in a new system, so right, the contradictions, and particularly the exploitation of a subordinate class becomes more and more obvious, and the conflict between the ruling class and the subordinate class sharpens until there is a revolution of some sort, and a new synthesis, right? In terms of a new material dominant class emerges. And once again, we have a new dominant class and a new subordinate class in terms of their material position. And we get a new, what we would call, mode of production, a new sort of historical epic of economic production. And we'll get to that in the next slide. But with a new group who's on top and a new group who's on bottom. And that moves forward throughout history, with, again, the contradictions of each period leading to a new formulation in the next period, right? And we'll get to all that. But again, importantly here, this idea that the ideas that we think are so important in our lives, that we think decide how we're going to live and behave, and the kinds of things we support and oppose, Marx says that's all just what he calls superstructure. It's a sort of a window dressing that cleans up the base, which is the actual organization of what he calls, again, the means of production, the ways in which wealth is produced and distributed in society. Says that superstructure is all there to make the base seem natural and permanent and just. Right, so it's all in service of maintaining an economic order. And so here I have sort of a reworking of Hegel, where you have the the thesis being the system with a specific ownership of the means of production. Again, the means of production being the sources of wealth, be it land or factories or whatnot, or investment capital in the modern sense. The people who own everything and who are at the top of society. Then you eventually get a challenge by the people whose labor is being extracted, and who are being oppressed, and the conflict between these two produces a new dominant class that then oppresses the new underclass, and that this process again continues and drives forward through history. So this slide is especially messed up, but we'll be all right. I think that what's being covered up there is a little bit repetitive anyway. So for Marx, there are these stages of history that we've passed through or are yet to pass through. And he thinks they're not just arbitrary or accidental or interchangeable. He thinks there's a sequence, again, much like how Plato in Book 8 of the Republic thinks that there is a sequence in which political regimes pass from one to another. Marx thought that historical epics, defined by what we call the mode of production, how resources were produced and distributed, that is sort of a sequence that logically one is going to follow the other, because again, the conflicts and contradictions of one give rise to the shape and nature of the next one. And in that sense, he famously sort of suggests that each system contains the seeds of its own destruction. And so I think a useful one to consider here is feudalism and its relationship to the English Civil Wars. If you go back to our sort of story about Charles I in Parliament, and this idea that the king and the feudal system, in order to um, sustain and run the feudal system under the king, he needed the resources of the landed elite, and eventually the merchant class. So this idea that the need for money causes the king to rely more and more upon this subordinate class until eventually they challenge his power, and we have the English Civil Wars. In the end, we get the Glorious Revolution, and the king, tamed by Parliament, and eventually, Parliament and the landed aristocracy is supplanted by the moneymakers, by the merchants, by the people whose wealth and whose productivity was at issue in the conflict in the first place. And so that we get the development then of capitalism, where the dominant force in society is the moneyed elite, and they end up being the superior economic and political and social force, instead of the feudal lords and the king. And Marx is going to say that, right, that this happens as we move through each of these systems: a primitive sort of, communism, think, state of nature kind of stuff, or think physical anthropology, go back before, or to early pre-agricultural or early agricultural kind of life. That then we get this kind of war and slavery, then feudalism, and a more organized form of feudal lords and serfs, and then we get capitalism, and we get the bourgeois and the proletariat, and then eventually, when the contradictions of capitalism cause that system to fail, we'll move eventually to his idea of communism, or a society of collective ownership, in which there is one class. There is no class conflict anymore. And so for Marx, that's the end of history, because it's class conflict that drives history forward, that moves us to new forms of living. And once there is no class conflict, that's it for Marx. And right, this historical materialism is fascinating, but also, for me, not one of the more necessarily persuasive forms of Marx, not because he does not insightfully see the contradictions and the conflicts within each system, but the necessary element, the idea that there's only one way that it could have happened, and only one way that it could happen into the future, seems to me a bit, you might say, overdetermined. But anyway, particularly in capitalism, the problem is that by its very nature, it impoverishes and exploits the masses until they eventually, their living condition and their experiences become so harsh that they gain consciousness, class consciousness. They realize their position. They realize the falsehood of the ideology that justifies their position, and they rise up against the ruling class, the 1%, what have you. And take over the means of production and redistribute them. And it's worth noting here that Marx, throughout his writing, always says that capitalism is essential in the process of history, because it produces the vast amount of wealth. He says capitalism, it's a super, super productive mode of production. And so it produces great wealth for industrial societies, and that great wealth is a precondition to the shift to communism, because communism then redistributes and organizes that wealth. But you're not going to get there directly out of feudalism, which is interesting, because all of the societies that made the jump to communism, particularly Russia, were feudal states. They were agricultural, undeveloped, poor states. And Marx specifically said it's going to be Germany, it's going to be England, it's going to be France, it's going to be America, these highly industrialized states that are very wealthy, but have extreme inequality and extreme inequality in the distribution of that wealth. Yes, certainly, Tsarist Russia had extreme inequality, but in the sense that, like, you had the Tsar and his court, and then just an entire nation of impoverished peasants. There was not a great amount of wealth in Russia to redistribute. And so some critics of the idea that communism in Russia or in China are good examples are like, these are very un-Marxist, at least in terms of the necessary development of history. These are very un-Marxist examples in which people skipped essential steps in the development of society. And so I think it's worth noting that. Class consciousness, again, is an idea that is at the center of Marx, and this idea that your experience of the world as being so harsh and different and discordant with the ruling ideas eventually wakes you up and says, oh my God, everything I've been told about the way society works is a lie. And it's a lie here to oppress me and to make me accept my condition at the bottom of society. I'm done with that. When the conditions of society get so bad that everyone, right, the 99% suddenly says, hey, all of us, we're all getting screwed here. We wake up, we have the numbers, we overthrow the elites. Marx would have said that we were sort of, in late stage capitalism. And right, there's a little sort of sub-stage in here that some people call socialism, that Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. We'll get to that in a minute, but that's sort of a sub-stage between capitalism and communism, but maybe it is Marx's biggest problem. We'll get to that in a later slide. So one of the most interesting parts of Marx, and I think one of the most useful, is the way he describes the logic of different systems. Each system of production, each way of organizing the economy and the resources and the power of a given society, a given era of society, has its own logic that is always pushing in a certain direction. And we might critique this in certain ways and ask how we've gotten out of this logic. I have at the bottom of the slide and such. But the idea that there's a certain way that capitalism or any system works, and kind of distilling that down to its pieces, I think is a real strength of Marx. It's one of the reasons that even in economics and such, more in history, Marx is taught. And so the logic of capitalism is that every capitalist, right, or every owner of the stuff of society, the means of production, the sources of wealth in society, used to be land, then it was factories. Now it tends to be, intellectual and investment capital. We also call these the bourgeois or the bourgeoisie. That these individuals are not free. Remember how Rousseau said that everybody is in chains, and that includes the people who are in control and think they're the boss. And I think that Marx kind of right, he explains a little bit of that. He says, if you own a factory, if you own some kind of large business, you are under an imperative that you are not free to deny. And that imperative is to maximize your profits and to be as productive as possible. This is why capitalism is so productive. You have to produce the most best stuff at the least cost. Otherwise, someone else will do it and put you out of business. And that's the way the market works, right? And it produces a lot of cheap goods. And it's very productive. It's very productive. But what it means is that if you make a value decision, if you try to be a nice capitalist and say, you know what, I'm going to pay my workers a little bit more, I'm going to give them longer breaks, more vacation, I'm going to upgrade the factory so that they have ergonomic chairs and nice air conditioning. Well, maybe some of that gets justified by higher levels of productivity, but it's only justified if there are higher levels of productivity, if you can do more because of that. Because if you don't, then the factory owner who didn't pay for the air conditioning, who doesn't pay the same wages, who doesn't give as much vacation or benefits, who forces his workers to work longer hours and doesn't and cuts corners on their occupational health and safety, and apart from workers, right, cuts corners on environmental safety and other kinds of cost prohibitive measures. Well, they're going to be able to sell their widget, their chair, their steak, their computer, whatever, their cell phone, whatever it is they're producing. They're going to be able to sell it for cheaper than you can. And one of the forces of capitalism, consumerism, which is takes the natural desire to enjoy the use of things and adds on to it certain ideologies of consumption, Marx would say, that pushes people to buy the most stuff for the least amount of money. And I think that we see this. I mentioned in class that as someone who's done a lot of both animal advocacy and studying of the animal rights movement, it seems pretty clear cut that it is very, very hard to change people's point of sale behavior and get them to buy virtually identical goods that cause less exploitation of animals or the environment, but cost a lot more. That you get some people to do that, particularly people with disposable money who gain certain kinds of enjoyment, or avoid certain types of guilt by making those purchases, or gain certain kinds of identity by being the kind of person who purchases them. But overwhelmingly, it is the cheapest identical product that gets purchased. And Marx says that's how it works. And the nice capitalist is out of business, and all you have left is the cruel, efficient capitalist who then has to compete to hold off the even crueler, more efficient capitalist. And think about the logic of corporations. That's what corporations are designed to do. If you are not maximizing profit for shareholders, you are a bad corporation. You're only supposed to avoid avoid that maximization of short-term profit if you are protecting the long-term profit and stability of the company by, currying public favor or political importance, or developing talent that can be more productive through education or through attracting workers with benefits and things like that. But Marx thinks that's not the way it's going to work, typically, in part because he sees the advancement of technology as devaluing labor, right? So when you think about the auto industry and you look at images of assembly lines, or you look at that Amazon warehouse, right? You take the assembly line or the warehouse, and it takes 100 people during year one to do X amount of work. But by year 10, you have robots and other forms of automation and technology and even just organization that are allowing that same amount of work to be done with 10 people on the floor. Well, what are those other 90 people going to do? They might find new jobs. But Marx says that this is a constant force in labor, where labor is rendered more abundant and less necessary, and therefore less powerful, and that the bargaining position of labor is always undermined by the advancement of technology and the advancement of capitalism, and therefore workers are always begging to stay employed, to keep their jobs, to keep their position, and it means they will always take less. And specifically, that means that the proletariat, right, the working class, is an opportunity, and an opportunity that they must take to stay in business for work, or for capitalists, for the bourgeoisie. They have to extract that extra value. If they can pay their workers $8 an hour instead of $12 an hour, they have to do that. They have to take that extra $4 an hour and use it to lower the price of the goods that they're selling. Otherwise, they'll be outcompeted. And so this idea that there is surplus value in the laboring class and the proletariat, in the sense that, well, there's a certain amount that you have to pay them in order for them to survive and be able to keep doing their work. But beyond that, you don't have to. That's value that can be extracted by the owners of the means of production if there's a labor surplus. And again, Marx thinks that's how labor is always going to work, and that value is going to be extracted. And it's worth noting that he saw this in his lifetime. He saw factories bringing in people from the countryside, He saw people working longer hours for low wages, that didn't keep up with the cost of living, in poor, dangerous conditions. He saw child labor. He saw people losing fingers and hands in looms and other kinds of industrial equipment, and receiving no benefits, no support, being cast aside. And so, right, this is his concern, right? Longer hours, lower wages, less spent on safety measures and comfort measures, and an increasing division of labor, where we maximize the productivity of what you do by specializing one simple task that you do over and over and over again. And we even see this in complex, humanistic things like the academy, where people specify into teaching one very specific area. They become an expert on that one area, and they try to, as efficiently as possible, work in that one area, instead of being sort of a jack of all trades, where you have to come to understand and teach and produce classes on many different subject matters. If I just taught intro political science, over the years, I would develop the ability, as many adjuncts are forced to do, adjunctification of the academy. We don't have it at McDaniel very much, but it's a strong force that people think is advanced capitalism at work. It's Marxism in the academy, or Marxism's critique of capitalism in the academy. But where we see poorly paid, minimally paid academics with all surplus value extracted from them, teaching a course like Intro Spanish or Intro English 12 times at 5 different colleges or universities in a semester, and making $25,000 a year, just enough to survive. And they're able to produce that amount of production, right? That amount of classes, because they're only doing one thing over and over and over again, and they're be able to do it enormously efficiently. This video lecture I'm recording now, if I use this as the basis to teach 12 classes of intro political theory, I could be much more productive. But it would be a very sad way of life, and that extra production, if I were an adjunct doing that, would not go to me. It would go to the institution that I worked for. Anyway, eventually, right, the logic of capitalism states that as more and more workers are unemployed, as they're working longer hours for less money or for less purchasing power, eventually they start to wake up. They start to, their dehumanization, their exploitation becomes so obvious to them. The things they're told about society and meritocracy and the rising tide lifts all boats and all of those things become so obviously false compared to the life experience that they and the people they know have lived, that they say, eventually they realize, oh man, we are being screwed here, no more. They rise up, they have the numbers, they have the power once they realize they have it, and they can dispatch the ruling class, who ruled, precariously, in part through the use of and through the dominance of ideology that's eventually upset, that can't be sustained. And we've talked a little bit in this class, but the idea of standpoint theory, the idea that when we're looking at our institutions and our ideas, as we are in this class with decolonization, the experience of the oppressed helps unmask ideology. It helps unmask the ways in which the ideas that structure society don't match the actual lived experience or the lived conditions or the functioning of the institutions of society. And, a dominant one is the American dream that we've talked about in this class a little bit. The idea that if you work hard, anyone can make it in America. Well, if you've worked hard your whole life, and the people around you have worked hard your whole life, and you haven't made it, and they haven't made it, start asking questions about, is that ideology really an accurate description, and is it a just description of society, right? And so we see this with gender, we see this with race, and we're going to deal with these ideas of critical race or feminist theory as standpoint theories in the final week of the class. Now here's here's a problem, right? Here's a problem that we've discussed over and over again in class, and I want to highlight it here. It's a problem with all the revolutionary theories that we've come across. By the way, up here, right, we've got Foxconn workers putting together your iPhone in horrible, dehumanizing conditions where they're paid very little. can never afford an iPhone themselves. Their labor is extracted to make something of great value that then goes into, the pockets of the shareholders of Apple. That extra surplus value is extracted and given to the shareholders of Apple, and that's the way our system, again, massively productive. But all right, to move on. Sorry, the problem again that I was mentioning is this idea that if capitalism dehumanizes and brainwashes people, as we'll get into, and makes them, as Plato, Machiavelli, Rousseau said, somehow unfit to govern themselves. Right? They go along with the system, and that is sort of part of their corruption and dehumanization. Well, how do they break out of that cycle? How do you get out of the cave? How does Machiavelli move us from the prince to the discourses, to the republic he likes? How does Rousseau get us from the broken, oppressive, everyone in change society to the social contract with the general will? Well, they all have their answers, and it usually involves someone who knows more than everyone else taking over and re-educating people, rehabituating people, or raising up a new generation in a better society that allows their freer or better structured selves or souls or what have you to emerge and develop in a way that then lets them participate fully in society, perhaps like with Machiavelli and Rousseau in a self-governing republican society. But for Marx, how do we do it? Well, we have the vanguard of the proletariat, the intellectual elite, that kind of puts all of these experiences. They come to understand the experiences of the proletariat. They put it together with a theoretical understanding of the structures of politics and economy, and they organize the people and they help shepherd forward this class consciousness. And then once the people take over, they're still corrupted by capitalism. They still want stuff, and they want to consume, and they want as much as possible, and they want to own it themselves instead of sharing, right? Because that's how they've lived their whole lives. That's what it means to succeed and to do well, is to get stuff and have it be yours, and get more stuff than the person next to you. And so Marx says, how do we get out of that? Well, we're going to have something between capitalism and communism called the dictatorship of the proletariat, where people are re-educated and the public is restructured, a new generation is raised that lives under socialism and develops a sort of a more enlightened, a more liberated view of themselves and the world and their community. Sounds like Rousseau and the legislator, Plato and the myth of the metals and the philosopher king, Machiavelli and the prince. We've got the vanguard and the dictatorship of the proletariat in Marx. It's a common theme in revolutionary. We can do better. We can do significantly better than we're doing now. But how do we get there, right? There's always this sort of catch in a lot of these ideologies or in a lot of these political theories. There's also the question that's raised not simply by the question of how the vanguard is able to break out of sort of the straitjacket of capitalist liberal ideology, but there's also the question of, it seems like we have been able to buck this logic of capitalism and restrain the forces of exploitation through things like minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws and OSHA, occupational health and safety laws, and redistribution of wealth to the poor elderly through Social Security. And Medicare and Medicaid and all of these systems that provide this safety net, this welfare capitalism. In other countries, other capitalist countries like the Scandinavian countries have gone even further, and they're doing Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism stuff. They're using the power of the people through democracy to constrain and reshape and redistribute the wealth produced by capitalism. Doesn't it seem like they have managed to get through or around the logic of capitalism? And that's a question, right? Is this capitalism making a last-ditch effort, with FDR, during the Great Depression to constrain itself in a way that allows it to sustain itself, and then get back to the work of creating a vaster and vaster inequality like we have right now. And if that is what capitalism has done, is that good or bad, right? Is that a kinder, gentler, productive, and yet more humane capitalism, or is it still an entrenched form of exploitation, and we can do much better? And that's the question that we continue to confront with the relationship of Marxism to our current society. So, as we've noted already, Marx inverts Hegel, and he says that it's not the ideas and the ideologies that drive society, but it's the material clashes and interests and conditions that organize society, that then give rise to ideologies that justify and sustain them. And so, the idea here would be that all of the ideas that we think are so important to our lives, that we think are essential or natural or true, or have won out in some marketplace of ideas, as the best political theory, or the best ideology, or some kind of divine truth, perhaps. These all develop either consciously or unconsciously. They're the ones that succeed. They're the ones in a kind of Darwinian sense, survival of the fittest ideas. Well, what is a fittest idea? It's the idea that meshes up and justifies and sustains the current distribution of the means of production. So in terms of sort of capitalist and advanced capitalist society, we're left here wondering with, why do we like Locke so much, which is a dominant theme in this course? Everybody loves Locke. Locke is so true. Locke is so right. We love Locke and his liberalism. We love his natural rights. We love his property rights. We love his limited government. There's a reason why you love that, and that's because it makes sense of the world as it is. And what does making sense of the world as it's organized do? It allows it to keep on operating, and it allows those on top to keep on being on top, and those on the bottom to accept their role at the bottom. And so, again, the idea that we love Locke because Locke tells us that everything's okay. Don't change anything. Everything's okay. Because America is a Lockean nation, and people have a natural right to the property, to the stuff they have. Jeff Bezos, he earned it. It's his. It's a right to that property. And government should be limited. The people, the masses, should not be able to and should not want to use government in order to take a chunk or all of Jeff's wealth and use it to feed the poor and give people health care. And you know what? If they did, it would cause an end of society and chaos, and everything would crumble and everyone would be poor and destitute. Is that true? Is that an ideology that we've all bought? Is that something that squares the circle of injustice and inequality that we all experience and makes it seem like it is what it is? You can't do any better. Right? And I've already mentioned ideas like meritocracy, or famously, if you're a Weber fan, if you're doing a little bit more, we do a little Weber in political science, but if you're doing more in sociology, the idea of the Protestant work ethic, that being a productive, hardworking laborer is a sign of divine providence. And the people who go to heaven, who are going to, who are God's chosen, are the ones who work hard. So you should work hard to prove that you are one of God's chosen, right? This sounds to some people crazy. This is Weber's understanding of Protestantism. And boy, isn't it convenient, again, that this sort of Protestant work ethic meshes up so nicely with capitalist productivity. Religion, as I've mentioned, the opioid of the masses. Yeah, you're toiling and things are kind of rough on this earth. You're poor and your kids don't have proper education or health care, and you can't buy new clothes for them. And yeah, you work 60, 70 hours a week in a job you hate, and you barely make enough to pay your rent. But, other people are living it up. Jeff Bezos is in his, has his dozen multi-million dollar mansions that he moves between. And yeah, right. Different people are having different outcomes, but don't worry about it, right? Because, in the end, and by the end, I mean after you're dead, you're going to go to heaven because you're one of the virtuous poor who was peaceful and tolerant and kept your nose down and didn't make waves, and accepted your lot in life humbly. And good for you. You'll be rewarded in the afterlife. Marx says, yeah, of course, this stuff spreads and people buy it. They buy it because it takes the pain. It's the opioid. It takes the pain of life away and says, all right, like I can deal with this because I have this great comfort coming in the afterlife. Yeah, I don't know, right? Marx says we believe that. The reason why religion is so popular is because it makes sense of and justifies and smooths over exploitation. And it's no accident, Marx would say, that certain types of religious belief are the most popular because they're the most functional. They do the most work for the status quo. He also would add on to their consumerism, right? Well, geez, how do you keep the engine of productivity going? Well, you convince people to work more and more to buy more and more stuff. If you want more stuff, you got to work more. If you work more, you can buy more stuff, right? And in each part of this, the more you work and the more you buy, each transaction, each part where you contract and sell your labor or sell or turn back over the fruits of your labor, a chunk of that ends up in the pockets of the ruling class, of the capitalist class. And this consumerism this commodification of things, this need to own stuff, to have stuff, even stuff that is of no practical use to you, is maybe just a status symbol with an emblem on it, or a connection to a certain company or celebrity or something like that. That Marx calls this a fetishization. Right? We know about fetishes, and it's the idea that you place absurd and irrational value upon something. You want it more than you need it. Right? It's how Marx thinks that the system turns our wants into needs. I have to have that thing. If I don't have it, I'm going to be unhappy. I'll never be happy. I'm so depressed. But if I had that thing, if I bought that product on Amazon, maybe I'd be happy. And this is just sort of an interesting little story with me. When I was studying all this stuff, I recognized at one point that I was spending a lot of time doing my work in a Borders bookstore, coffee shop. And I would go in there and I would have this urge to buy books. And I often would. There'd be, buy two, get one free. And I'd come home with 3 books when I couldn't even finish reading the books that I had. And I knew that those books I was buying would just plop up on the shelf, maybe never to be read. And yet I wanted to have them. I wanted those. I wanted to own them. I didn't want to go to the library and check them out. Those books were available at the library, and if I really just wanted to read them, I could go there and read them. I didn't even want to read them. I wanted to own them. I wanted to have them. This consumerist, right? And what did I do? I popped down $20 on 3 books. And the bookstore, the chain, made some cash. I got my books, and it gave me this warm, fuzzy feeling, though it certainly does not last, because there's no substance to it. You got to keep feeding that addiction, that want. Another opioid for the masses, consumerism. But this is an especially good one because it keeps pumping forward economic activity. It keeps justifying productivity. And right, if we all saved more, if we all spent less, if the consumer, the backbone of American economy, didn't continue to work more in order to spend more, and spend more because they work more, then the engine of our economy, this idea that we should have perpetual GDP growth, might grind to a halt, right? The system would not be able to sustain itself. So consumerism is a real hook. A lot of people, the critique of consumerism is where Marx really starts to make sense to a lot of people. And I'll get to this slide in a minute. People are working more in jobs they hate for shit they don't need. Is a pretty good explanation of Marx's critique of capitalism. Now, we also have things like nationalism, or darker versions of racism, anti-Semitism. Marx famously wrote on the Jewish question. Why do we have he has this Jewish background, but he's also critical of Judaism as, again, one of the opioids of the masses. But Marx also says, why do we have all of this racism, this anti-Semitism, this nationalism, this xenophobia? Well, it's because, when you're sitting there and saying, well, why is my life suck? It doesn't seem to fit this idea of meritocracy. Oh, it's because affirmative action is giving all the jobs to those people. It's because the immigrants are coming in and stealing our jobs, and they're using up all of our tax dollars, and I have to pay more taxes. And this idea that we have to find out who is responsible, and it's never the owners of the means of production. It's always some vulnerable group. Marx would say that's where racism comes from. That's what sustains it. That's what religious bigotry, that's where it comes from. That's what sustains it. If it's not doing the work of sustaining the system and dividing the working class, then it's just going to peter out because that's its primary function. Now, a lot of people take offense at this, that religion or ethnic pride or nationalist pride, patriotism, that the function of all of these things is to divide the working class and to turn them against foreigners or immigrants or people of a different race or ethnicity or gender. That's right. That's a controversial statement, but it's also a powerful one that we should continue to explore in this class. And finally, we've got this idea here that all of these things that we believe in terms of a false consciousness. The idea that you genuinely hold these values. You genuinely believe that Jeff Bezos deserves his property, that it's his, that he has a right to keep it, that you would be wrong if you took it from him, if we took it from him. And Marx says that's false consciousness. You believe things that are not in your interest, and the reason you believe them is to serve the interests of people other than you. And so again, we need to break through that. We need to uncover our biases and the ways in which we buy into the system and discover a truer consciousness, a class consciousness, where we see our common interests and our common goals. Right? It sounds a little like Rousseau, right? If we can break through, we may have to force you to be free because you're playing along with the oppressor because you think that your religion or your American dream ideology or your belief in meritocracy or your racism, all of that may justify the current distribution of power and resources in society. We've got to break through that, Marx says. False consciousness is both one of the most powerful concepts in Marx, but it's also, it's the condescending nature of it. You don't know your own interests. I know your interests for you better than you do. Is a difficult one. Again, takes us back to Plato. Takes us all the way back to this idea of you're just trapped in the cave. You don't realize the stuff you don't realize. If you knew what I knew, then you'd choose differently. Even Mill says the same thing. If you knew what I would, if you knew what I knew, if you'd experienced what I'd experienced, you would choose the higher pleasure too. So it's a constant theme of people making choices that are bad for themselves. That runs from Plato all the way through to Marx, but stopping off at people like Mill, who are like or all of the social contract theorists. Like if you're in your right mind, this is the choice that any individual would make. And that kind of true objective interest is a very it goes back to the ancients, but it's also very thick in the moderns. And the rejection of that idea that there are objective truths or right ways of thinking or right interests that can be identified objectively for people is something that breaks apart with sort of the end of modern political theory and the rise of postmodernism. So one of the ideas that is most compelling to a lot of readers of Marx, even if they don't agree that the capitalist system will be or should be overthrown, the darkest parts of living under a capitalist system, the parts that maybe leave us feeling anxious and depressed and unmoored and without purpose or meaning in our lives, isolated, disconnected from other people. Or alienated or estranged, as Marx puts it. That sense of things aren't right. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm miserable. And why is that? It's something that right. It appeals to me. It attracts me. attracts a lot of college students too. It's maybe that's why I was so into Marx. Is what's this life all about? What is where do I find the meaning? Where do I find the purpose? Where can I find satisfaction in doing a job and getting a paycheck? When am I not just going through the motions that society directs me to? Right, Rousseau. When am I really making free choices instead of just going along with social forces? Um, and alienation for Marx, specifically in terms of labor, involves alienation in four ways. And just very quickly, I'll run through these. These are all listed out and discussed in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. But first off, this idea of estrangement or alienation, meaning like lack of meaningful connection to things and people and experiences. First, it's alienation from the product of your labor. These individuals here on the assembly line. This is a Ford Motor assembly line. They're doing their little tasks, and they screw in a bolt. And then the whatever the hell they're working on there moves on down the line, and they never get to see a product from start to finish and see it take shape and become real, become a car in front of their eyes through the work of their own hands. And more importantly, perhaps they're not making it for themselves. They're not making it for anyone they care. They are making it for a paycheck, and then the product itself. What happens to it? Who cares? It goes, someone buys it, someone, the company sells it, makes a profit. Somebody much wealthier than you buys it. They go drive it to the opera. You don't feel a connection to that product in the same way that if you carved a rocking chair, you would feel, a deep and personal connection to taking that wood and transforming it into something useful that you or your loved ones or someone in your community might use. And right, we talk about a meal that you cook for your family or the produce that you garden. The real connection to those products is, for Marx, very important. It's a very human thing. And also the act of laboring. If you are laboring because you're being controlled and told by a superior, do this, do that. If you are only doing those actions for a monetary gain in order to feed your family, in order to pay your rent, the act of work itself becomes torture. It becomes dehumanizing. And, right, everybody's working for the weekend, right? What's everyone's favorite day of the week? Maybe it's Friday because the work week ends. Maybe it's Saturday because it's the farthest part you have from work. Maybe it's Sunday because it's your last relaxing day where you've really de-stressed and you've got Saturday behind you and you're finally ready to unwind and watch some football or go to church or whatever. And what's your least favorite day? It's Monday, back to work, or it's Wednesday, it's hump day, right? The middle of the work week. The idea that laboring is the worst part of your life and sitting around doing nothing, watching Netflix is the best part of your life, or Marx would say doing your sort of animalistic pleasures, eating, having sex, watching entertainment, these kinds of passive or non-creative consumptive activities, that those should be the best parts of your life. And the times when you're using your mind and your hands to change the world and to interact with your fellow people, those are the worst parts of your life. Man, right? That's terrible. And I think this makes sense. People who love their work, who don't consider their work, right? They're happy when they're happiest going out and, I'm sorry to talk about the NFL so much, but when you play football for work and what you really want to do is play football and it's your favorite thing to do, yeah, no, that's great. But, we also find that when people turn their passions, the kinds of work that they like to do spontaneously, into wage labor. You're an artist, but now you're taking commissions and you're working for a corporation that tells you to make this emblem and that emblem. A lot of the shine off the work itself that you might have enjoyed that work if you'd been doing it spontaneously for yourself. A lot of it, becomes burdensome. You're also estranged from yourself. And by that, he means your species being. I said that Marx is a big, human nature, thick human nature. What does it mean to be truly human, to not be dehumanized? It means to be a productive, creative, social animal, developing your productive and creative capacities, bettering yourself, gaining skills, gaining knowledge, and using that knowledge for yourself and the people you care about. That's what it means to be truly human for Marx. And if you're not doing that, then you're dehumanized in some way. You lose your identity. You lose your sense of self. And finally, you're estranged from your fellow man or your fellow person in the sense that in a capitalist system, you're competing for that job, for that paycheck, for that raise with your fellow workers and the people all around you. And their gain is your loss, right? If you have 20 people vying for that one job, you guys know this, you apply to a job with 50 different applicants, and you find out that one of your friends is in that applicant pool, and suddenly you're rooting to beat that friend out because you need that job. And imagine in an advanced capitalist system where the factory that is the only source of employment in the community, well, we have 3 openings, and you 10 people will take 3 of you. How do you feel about those workers? You want to beat them out, right? And if they get the job instead of you, you hate them. And if you get the job instead of them, they hate you. And you're concerned that they're going to try to do the job for less, that they're going to drive down your wages, that they're going to, starve your family by taking your work. Not a good way to feel in community with people. And who do you feel even worse about? Your employer. That person, that slave driver, that taskmaster that tells you turn that widget faster. Did you hand in your report for your week? Your daily log? Did you punch in 5 minutes late? Was productivity up to the projections that we were looking for? You don't like that. If you don't like your job, you really don't like your boss. And you know what? Your boss has to go through life working with and being around people who don't like him too. Right? So this is an interesting thing, right, towards the end here. This idea that capitalists and managers, as Rousseau says, we're all unfree, even and especially the people who are in charge. They may live a more secure, comfortable life, but they don't have freedom and they don't have community. They're still alienated and estranged, and that's not a truly human life. Being a capitalist is not as good as, having less power and less possessions, but living in a true equal community where people work together and work for each other as well as themselves. That's a truly human way of living, even with less stuff. And that's something that I think Marx strongly believes in. Right? So again, this idea that the answer for Marx isn't higher wages. It's not raising the minimum wage, right? All that does is, for Marx, protect a system of exploitation where you're selling yourself, where you're being dehumanized by doing work you don't want to do in order to get a paycheck that you need. Taking away your choice, your freedom to live the way that you would want to if you were not constrained by society, as Rousseau says, and specifically not constrained by the economic realities of society. And so again, would you be on that assembly line if you could help it? No, probably not. And in terms of dehumanization, right, I bring up it because Marx brings up prostitution and sex work. And says, he says there's something wrong with sex work. What it is that you're selling essential parts of yourself, of your humanity to other people for a paycheck, and not doing that, you call it labor, doing that labor because you want to, because you love someone, or because you enjoy it, because you want to share that experience with someone. Those are, perhaps all good reasons, to engage in sex. But for Marx, a good reason to engage in sex that you wouldn't have otherwise is not because you need the money. But Marx isn't shaming sex work, although it's right during the time period there's an element of that. He's saying, when you go flip burgers, you're doing the same thing. When you go, pour that coffee at Starbucks, when you go, when the adjunct teaches their 12th class of the semester, they're all doing things in ways that they would not because they need the money, because the system is forcing their hand. And he says that kind of system is wrong. It makes something work, labor, that could be beautiful and life affirming into something that's dehumanizing, right? This is not a slap against sex work. It's saying that the way that many people think about sex work as dehumanizing is the way Marx thinks about all exploited labor, all labor that's not truly free. And he thinks that a lot of labor, right, is really all labor in a capitalist society isn't free, because your very wants are structured, right? False consciousness are structured by the society. Oh, I really want to be a lawyer. I really want to work 70 hours a week in a law firm, defending corporate profits, in order to, afford, my fancy Manhattan studio apartment. Do you really want all those things? Do you really? Or, yeah, are you working a job you don't really like and enjoy, that you don't feel life affirming, for stuff that you don't need, that's not really useful to you, but that you've somehow been made to want? Are you really free? Um, and you're in that job that you don't love, that doesn't make you feel whole. All right, I've covered some of these ideas like alienation that I think often speak to people who aren't really, itching for a communist revolution in society. And I think that you can see a lot of these ideas reflected in movies that, at least for me, have over the course of my life hit home. And the first one I have up here is Office Space. I need those TPS reports. Which, I know The Office does this pretty well, but I don't think as well as this movie from I guess the '90s, Office Space, which I recommend to all of you guys, about how depressing and dehumanizing and just life crushing working in an office, just trying to get by and draw your paycheck because you don't know what else to do with your life. Well, what do? You go to college, you get a job, you go to the job, you do the tasks, you get old, you have a family, you die, and that you go through the motions, controlled by people you don't like and by social forces all around you, and it's just, and that it's a hilarious movie. It's a hilarious movie. Um, but I highly recommend it. Maybe I'll give you guys a clip up on Blackford, a movie that maybe more of you guys have seen. We've got Brad Pitt here in Fight Club, with the famous line early on said to Edward Norton, the things you own end up owning you. Right? Why are you obsessed with having all the things from the IKEA catalog in your apartment? You're working a job you don't like. Again, right? Here's the line that he gives later on, that Tyler Durden gives to the assembled group, the Fight Club group, and I'll read it for you guys, just because you're going to take a moment to read it here. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'll all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off. It's a movie about class consciousness and discovering that the system does not serve the genuine needs of the working class, and those working class building a revolutionary community together in order to overthrow the system, and particularly the financial capitalist core of the capitalist system. It is a Marxist revolutionary movie, and a lot of people it resonates with. It did with me. Maybe I'll give you this clip, or a clip or two. I'll try to get some good embeds on Blackboard. But when I recommend these movies as just really great, fun movies to watch, but maybe give them a watch and think about the ways Marxism does at least make some sense of the things you don't like about your job, or about work, or about your life in this society, or maybe the things that you do like, right? The things that do work for you. Maybe it'll give you a little bit of a, oh yeah, right. I do love my job. How fortunate, why is it that I've managed that? Why does this job work for me? All right, sorry, second little clip here. This first paragraph, right, where I was talking about is your job fulfilling? I didn't really, get all that much into it, but this idea that yeah, you know what, there are parts of our jobs, or maybe entire jobs or careers that we don't find fulfilling, and why might that be? Again, some of this diagnosis: you lack control. You don't get to make your own decisions. You do what you're told. Do you lack purpose? You don't feel like you're meaningfully serving anyone, either in like a nonprofit capacity or cooking a good meal that people enjoy, or somehow providing a service that makes people happy or safe or better off, and that fills you with some kind of meaning or purpose in your life. Um, do you not work with teams? Are you either isolated, or are you working with people you don't like, or for people you don't like? Or do you feel a genuine connection and sort of togetherness in the projects that you work on? Right. For a lot of people, good teamwork and feeling like part of a team is an essential part to a good job. Um, do you lack opportunities to develop your skills and to progress and to become better as a worker, as a creator, as an individual? Can you develop your skills and employ them more and more in new and better and more interesting ways to do those things, to be a member of the team, to contribute to the team, or to achieve the purpose of the role or the job or the company that you're a part of, to gain more control and more autonomy in the way things are done. A lot of people who don't have that path to growth, to bettering their job, they don't stay in their jobs. And it's one of the very major reasons why people leave their jobs, is because there's no room for growth, and the job becomes boring and tedious, and again, dehumanizing. It doesn't feel like something that enriches them through the development of their productive capacities and their creative capacities and their skills. So I always ask this question, right? The guidance counselor question, I think, is a Marxist question. What would you do if, right, in Office Space, it's what would you do if you had $1 million? And I don't get into that one. It's a little off color as a joke. But what would you do if you never had to worry about money, or your kids' money, or your security, or your kids' security into the future? Marx would say that you won't, if unless you're really broken by this capitalist dehumanizing system that has you working for the weekend, you'll want to get off your butt, off the couch, and do things. You'll want to garden. You'll want to, volunteer. You'll want to maybe do the exact same job that you have. If I love reading these things and talking about them with you guys. Some version of this is probably something that I'd enjoy doing, at least part time, at least as a kind of work, making these videos for you guys, or having these reading groups or discussions. I do that for a paycheck, but I think I'd also like to do it not getting a paycheck. Not that I need the paycheck, right? So don't try to take my paycheck away. But that's a good marker. If you're doing something with your life that you would want to be doing, if you didn't have to worry about money, then you're probably on the right track to have a fulfilling, non-alienating, non-estranging kind of job. And again, the idea that that's possible under an advanced capitalist system is maybe evidence that Marx doesn't have everything right. So that's something to consider, and I think it's a fun one and a useful one for you to think about when you're evaluating your career, your future. I'm putting on my design hat right now. I think my design is a fundamentally Marxist kind of class. All right, so maybe Carl has won you over by this point. You think that he's right about some of the ills of capitalism, and that this is something that is either widespread or universal in the experience of working under capitalism. It's exploitative, and it's alienating. Maybe that part resonated with you, especially. You don't want to go through a career with a job. You're at this point in your life where you're looking for what you're going to do with the rest of your life, and you don't want to just work for a paycheck. You want to have meaning. You want your life, your job, to be self-affirming and to be enriching. You don't want to be dehumanized. So you say, Carl, well, what's next? And it's this question of, well, what would life be like under communism? Is it bad, or is it just utopian and impractical? And that's, different people, different strokes for different folks. But I think it's worth digging into that. And it can be hard to imagine. And frankly, Marx didn't write a ton about the specifics of what communism is actually going to look like. He spent a lot more time diagnosing the problems and the ills and the forces of that were at work under capitalism. Um, Now, first off, right, how's the work going to get done? Again, Marx says you're going to want to work. You're going to want to work because being productive, being creative is naturally satisfying to people. But you're also going to want to work because it helps the community. It satisfies the needs of the people around you. In the same way, and right, a lot of this comes back, like with Rousseau, to the family. But in the same way, you maybe feel good when you put in some labor for your family, and you get to see your family enjoy that meal, or the new car that you bought through your long hours at work. You feel good at the fruits of your labor, contributing to that most important in our lives, community. But Marx would say, you might feel like that about the larger community. And we come back often to military matters. But when people say, left and right, thank you for your service to military personnel, this idea of thank you for serving the community, Marx says, yeah, exactly, right? But the person who bakes your bread, servicing the community, the person who mows the lawn, servicing the community. All of these people are doing services. They are important, vital workers, right? We have this idea of essential workers. And Marx would say, when we're all doing jobs that are useful and productive for the community, we're all essential workers. And if we can think of ourselves that way and treat each other that way, you're going to want to do that work. You're going to volunteer, sign me up. And so the work will get done. It will get done because people like the work, but it'll also get done because people like working for their fellow people, the people they love, just like they maybe like working to buy their kid a gift. They'll like working in order to cook a meal at the restaurant that community members come and eat at. And he's going to say, you're already doing it, right? When you have free time, you're cooking, you're gardening, you're painting, you're writing. You're doing maybe you're knitting or woodworking. Maybe you're working on your car. You're rebuilding an engine. Maybe you're building a piece of furniture or a birdhouse or whatever. You're doing all this productive, creative labor. And you're doing it because you enjoy it. It's nice that you get the fruits of the labor, or you give it away as gifts, if you're making soap or candles or whatnot. But it's stuff you enjoy doing, and you enjoy that people enjoy the fruits of your labor. So why not on a larger scale? Right. And frankly, the most essential parts of our lives in our families, this stuff gets done because people want to do it. And again, right, with this idea of volunteering for an organization, I've worked at advocacy groups and I've had volunteers come in and do my job, the things that I'm doing, because they have free time and they want to, and they believe in it, and it gives them purpose and meaning. Well, just how much stuff are we going to be able to do because it gives our lives purpose and meaning? And one of the complaints about communism, or this idea of living in a communal society, and I've seen actually and studied some what we call intentional communities or communes that are set up in this way, and they do sometimes have problems with how to distribute the labor. But Marx would say those are pragmatic, figure out the right institution kind of problems. They're not a fundamental barrier of human nature. People like working, and they like working for their fellow people. So we get to the question of who does the dishes. And I bring that up because one community that I studied, they could manage to come up with institutions that got people to do every single job that needed to be done in the community. But they couldn't incentivize or encourage people to do the dishes enough that the dishes would get done. And eventually they had to say, everybody takes their turn doing the dishes. And, that might not be ideal. But even with that, the idea of, well, I'm doing my part for the community. I think is persuasive, even doing the dishes, right? Oh man, who wants to change that diaper, right? Well, I changed the diaper and I feel good. I helped my kid and, I played my role as a parent in this family. Well, playing your role in society is a powerful motivation. People, stood outside for hours and hours to vote. Why are you doing that? Why are you making that arduous sacrifice in order to play your role as a citizen of this society and this community? Marx says, it's because that's life affirming, and people are going to be willing to do that in a lot of different capacities. The family, again, becomes, I think, an essential model. Why are people willing to sacrifice and work, and often not even see it as a sacrifice in the sense that it is the thing that makes their life worth living? It's the thing that makes their life meaningful, working for their kids, working for their spouse, taking care of their parents, things like that. And the most famous phrase for describing the way work is structured under communism is from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Um, and this might sound highly pie in the sky and not like a just distribution, but again, you work. We have these ideals in our society of public service that being a representative or a doctor, or, representative in government or a doctor or or any of a number of professions, that there's an element of service in there. You're doing because you can do, and the community needs you. Um, but also this idea that if you're hungry, you should have food. If you're sick, you should have health care. If you're cold, you should have clothes and a place to sleep. That these are things that we give to people not because they've contributed somehow to society, but because they need them. And in a truly human society, human, um, enlightened, emancipated society, Marx thinks that these things both get done. People produce and people receive, they consume, but we decouple them, and each one of them becomes a more affirming act. You're being served by the community because you have need. And you are serving the community because you have the opportunity. You can manage it. And this is right. So this gets us towards like an essential thing, right? Plato had his guardians and his auxiliaries. They didn't have any property. They slept. They didn't have homes. They didn't have families. They slept in bunk beds and common rooms. And I don't think that that's necessarily a part of communism. Maybe some of it is. There's certainly a lot of sharing of resources in communism, but the idea that you don't get your own clothes and your own bed, and you can't have your own family, you get all those things. There's a question though, particularly with the material goods, of how we distribute them and how we decide who gets how much, and how we create the institutional situation in which people make those choices. So maybe everyone gets 10 pairs of pants and you get to decide the style and the color. But you don't get 12 pairs of pants, and you don't, you don't get the Gucci pants or whatever kind of, does Gucci make pants? I don't even know. You get those useful utilitarian pants that everyone else gets. But maybe you can pick the color or the cut or things like that, right? Imagine you can walk into Old Navy and you get each month one piece you get a pair of pants and a shirt, and you can pick out any one you want. You get that choice, right? You can imagine that kind of system, perhaps. Um, so how do we distribute stuff? Well, the government will distribute some things in the same way but also, is it so different from when you apply for an application to work at some place, be it a government office or a private company, and they look at your resume and they decide whether or not you get the position. You come in, you do the work. I work you attend, and I work at a private college, but this could be a public college, public university, and it would function in largely the same way. There would just be a different ownership and a different ultimate decision-making body that set the policy and things like that. But the institution itself, and we see this in government institutions and agencies, and we see this to some extent in nonprofits, right? You could imagine a nonprofit being set up by the government. The Postal Service, right, was set up by the government. It functions independently and like a company, but the postmaster general is an appointed political, democratically appointed by democratic forces position. And yeah, it functions just fine for all of the complaints about mail-in ballots and whatever. It functions just fine. It's a good agency. So all these things that the government does, we collectively do without a profit motive and without a company raking in the dough for being in charge of the operation and doing the work and then extracting the surplus. Um, what would communism look like? It might look like libraries. Right? I've got McDaniel Library here, where you go in and there's shared spaces and shared computers and shared books and shared DVDs over here. Or maybe it would look more like Netflix and Spotify and these streaming services where, hey, guess what? Everyone gets an equal share. Use as much as you want, as much as you need. Um, and yes, we pay into the service, and these are private companies, but why do they need to be? They're online libraries in which the digital content is infinitely available to as many people who need it. And this idea that we're very comfortable with not, when I was your age, you had to own your DVDs, and not simply because that was the only way to watch them, but because it was part of your identity to have ownership over those movies. Part of who you were was your CD collection and your movie collection. That's what people wanted to see when they came over. And I'm not necessarily saying that's bad, but people curated their movie and music collections in order to project a certain image. And now we've moved on to a time where maybe I'm missing. Maybe you guys are linked up to your social media, so it says what you're reading or what you're watching or listening to. But this idea of, well, it's just all out there, to each according to their need or to their want. Um, and everyone gets equal access to the songs, all the songs that they can listen to, and yeah, that's fine, right? You guys live this life in some way, and public transit is, in addition to roads, is bridges and things like that, is the classic public service where we all share um, this public good. But there are a lot of private versions like ride shares, and I belonged to a car share when I didn't have a car and lived in Philadelphia for a while. People use bike shares and scooter shares, and you can imagine a system where it's like, oh well, how do I do these things? How do I have these things if I don't own them? If I don't work for a wage that allows me to buy the things that I want and have them exclusively to me? There's probably a lot less of that, than we necessarily need. And there's probably there are probably different alternative systems that are compatible, fully compatible with human nature and the enjoyment of the use value as opposed to the exchange value of those items. And so you can imagine all kinds of things. Everyone gets to go out to a restaurant once a week, and you can pick whatever restaurant you want. And that's your once a week, and we distribute it that way. Now, you might say, but I won't get to go out and have my, fancy $200 plate of foie gras. And it's like, maybe not, right? There might be sacrifices in some sense like that, but it's not that hard. I mean, cafeterias are like this too. It's not that hard to envision systems in which people, we distribute resources based on either need or equal access, right? Like wait in a line. The line is the most communist, method of distribution I can think of. First come, first serve. Everyone stands, and you get what you want the most, what you're willing to stand for, and but you can't take more than anyone else. And I often talk about like at Six Flags they now have like Flash Pass, and Disney has things like that where you can pay to go to the front of the line. You can pay for your position in the way that resources are distributed. You get to go on 10 roller coasters while the people who don't pay the money get to go on 5. And right? I mean, those are two different ways to do it, of doing things. But for most people, the most natural way to run an amusement park is everyone who goes there stands in line and gets as much rides as they want that they can have in terms of equality with everyone else. And we don't sell. At least for me, I never grew up with position and access to those resources being sold to the highest bidder. I don't think it's necessary for a properly functioning amusement park. And once again, right, schools, right, education in this country is largely you could say, socialized. National parks. We see a lot of countries do it with healthcare and, frankly, public hospitals, right? A lot of people get treated at public hospitals. The VA, where the president got treated for his COVID, is socialized medicine. Um, some countries drill for their oil and manage their natural resources publicly. There are a lot of ways that we can collectively manage ourselves. And again, I mentioned nonprofit organizations which manage privately to do these same kinds of functions and produce goods and services, and yet nobody makes a profit out of them. We can imagine different ways of living, and there's a question of, do we want them? Do we want to go all the way and live in a radically different way that's much less privatized, that has much more democratic social control of the distribution of resources? Well, I don't know. I don't know how far you guys want to go. But to think that it's natural, it's the only way, it's the only just, logical, fair way to live is the way that we distribute resources now under the current distribution of the means of production, the current distribution of opportunity and resource and wealth. It's not necessarily the case, right? There are other ways of living. And I encourage you guys to think about that, even if in the end what you decide, a la John Stuart Mill, is I've considered this communism stuff, and I've considered everything between laissez-faire capitalism and communism, and it turns out that I'm fine with exactly what we have right now. Well, kudos, good for you. That sounds like a happy life you've got in front of you. But maybe you'll discover something a little better, something maybe radically different that you haven't considered before. All right, folks, longest video ever. Sorry, but I think it's a good topic.